afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Boyd. I'm the CEO of Tanjo.ai here in the Research Triangle Park area of North Carolina. We're here today with an amazing brain trust of folks that I think I can only credit COVID with being able to pull all these people together. I doubt I'd ever get them in the same physical room to talk about this subject, but here we all are on this Zoom Salon. This is a part of a series of discussions that we've been having around the, not just the pandemic, but this inflection point we have that we find ourselves in the United States today around education. What does it look like now in the middle of this pandemic? What's it going to look like afterwards? And what is the role of R&D in education? And what should we be doing that we are not? So we've got a variety of perspectives here. I know Alan Kay said perspective is worth 80 IQ points. So I'm pleased to have everybody here that we do. And I'm going to call on each one of you very quickly and just ask you to introduce your perspective, just yourselves, and then we'll dive right in with some questions. So ladies first, Linda Bernard from here in Greensboro, North Carolina. Just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Bernard. I'm the director of middle school at Canterbury School in Greensboro. I have taught all different places in the world. And I'm particularly passionate about equity in education and about the benchmark that we in America are setting for our children.
Great. Thank you, Linda. Moving to my Hollywood Squares view across the top, Marc Prensky, my old friend. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Marc. My current interests are kids. I have a 2 billion kids project where I want to see what we can do to empower as many of the 2 billion kids as we can in the world. I'm also very interested at the moment in beliefs, in figuring out how beliefs or mindsets or lenses or values really underpin and affect things, and how we can help kids get better, more effective beliefs in the 21st century.
Great. Thank you for being here, Marc. And thank you for coining the term digital natives and digital immigrants, which I have used quite a bit in the last 20 years, all of us, to help frame these discussions. Russ Shilling.
Yes, I'm Russ. I spent 22 years in the military as a program manager and experimental psychologist, doing training systems and psychological health research, really looking at intersections with technology. Ended as a DARPA PM, then transitioned as a political appointee in the Obama administration in charge of STEM education at the Department of Ed. Then worked for Chan Zuckerberg and Gates for a while, helping them try to figure out how to implement basically a DARPA for education there, and which is now up and running a bit. So
great.
Kind of
and we have also in common that we work together on or in different places on the America's Army Game Project way back
many years ago.
When you were in Monterey.
Yes.
And Games for Change also. I've been to many of those conferences, and so I know you were on the board of that as well, right, Russ?
Board of Advisors. Yes. I've been building games really since 2002. So that's where I ran into Marc originally. So
that's right. Yeah, Marc was involved in that as well.
Yeah. At American Army, in fact, yes.
Okay, and Larry Singer, our vintner and man about town.
Man about town. Well, most recently, I ran a not-for-profit called Open Up Resources that we used a tremendous amount of funding from the Gates Foundation to create an alternative curriculum publishing model using open education resources for K through 12. Following the math and ELA standards, often known as Common Core, that are in some form or another in every state. Before that, I ran Pearson's K-12 businesses in North America, kind of the inverse of the not-for-profit work I was doing. Ran their K through 12 school business, which included not only curriculum, but formative and high-stakes summative assessments. We also sold about 90% of all the psychological tests that are given by psychologists in the United States, and tied those to educational outcomes. Prior to that, I was at the Kennedy School as a research fellow in technology and telecommunications in the public sector, and was the first CIO for the state of Georgia, and did some odds and ends, ran public sector for Hewlett Packard across domestic government, state, local, and education. Kind of came up with the term SLED for non-federal government.
Outstanding. Thanks again for being here and bringing your perspective. And last but not least, well, we're also going to talk about Will Jarvis here, who's going to let us know at the end of this where we can find the final views of this discussion. And then Brian Setzer, Dr. Setzer.
Hey, everybody. Good to see folks on the call. Marc, it's been a while. We had a chance, I think, in Michigan years ago to connect with St. Clair's RISA. So great to see you and recognizing many, voices in the field that I admire and respect. I think my short, pithy version would be we build the future of learning and work. So we're often asked to take on really thorny, complex problems that people have and walk them through. And so I've spent a career both as a practitioner, a designer, someone who sits at the epicenter of innovation and technology, but share Linda's passion around doing it all in the service of diversity, equity, and inclusion so that we can bring more voices to the bigger tables that matter. So our firm has been in existence 1 year, but if you know my past work, it's been a lot around innovating with school districts, universities, workforce, to take them from where they are to where they desire to be. So this has been a really deep year of doing that work and looking forward to sharing more of those stories and joining the discussion today.
Thank you. And Brian and I met when he was running the North Carolina Virtual Public Schools, are really trying to birth that effort. And we did what we could to help you in that effort, Brian, but thanks for being here as well. So let's dive right in. So Russ, I want to start with you. You wrote a pretty good article in 2012 in your role at the Department of Education working with Arnie Duncan and Jim Shelton, where we had all that beautiful energy around this idea of an ARPA for education, addressing the issue that, there's a lot of organizations out there that spend a lot or a healthy percentage, usually double digit, on research and development in any sort of information age company out there. And even the DoD spends a healthy percentage on R&D. I believe last year it was about $190 billion was the budget for DARPA, I think. No, DARPA was 3.5 billion and the total was 190 billion for R&D and acquisition. So let's just talk about what you wrote in 2012 and where do you think the energy is today and where the shortfall is?
Yeah, and I updated that a few months ago. So I've got a newer version up online talking about kind of the post-COVID environment. But basically my view, and again, not everybody agrees, I think we need a new way of looking at development for education technologies. One, the basic research is out there, but quite often it just doesn't marry up well with the real world when you're building these platforms, because so much of the outcomes are technology dependent. So in the DARPA model, basically what you're doing is you're conducting basic research, but it's towards an applied goal. So basically what I would like to see done is have more money put into individual projects, because the way the government typically does it is there's not enough money for doing both quality software development and quality educational outcomes and testing. So you really have to do both. And I believe in an iterative process for that to get to the results and really to take some big risks. So with the Gates Foundation and CZI post Obama administration, they got together and they actually are currently funding a relatively sizable project looking at executive function and math skills, putting those two issues together and having a diverse team of people both inside of education and technologists outside of education. So it kind of builds on that structure that we discussed for the DARPA model. When I was at DARPA, basically I was running a games program that basically evolved pedagogical approaches in a game based on the population playing it. So not only did it adapt to the individual, it learned from the entire population about optimum ways that people were solving problems within the game space. And we had Zoran Popovic out of University of Washington as one of our main performers for that. So,
and that wasn't real world, right?
That was not real world. That was Dan Kaufman's project before me, right. Which influenced me a lot. I worked for Dan, so.
Gotcha.
I went through the process. I had a phase 1 and a phase 2 grant from DARPA, so I know it from the side of somebody who has the grant.
Yeah. Well, it was nice to have a $35 million game program, so you can actually get some work done that way. So, especially when you're bringing outside talent in and trying to do things a little differently. So.
Right. So Larry, that adds your perspective. I know we've had a couple of conversations leading up to this about, where the gaps might be, and you've got some, I believe, deeply held beliefs in that regard. So what do you think we need to focus on?
I do.
And is ARPA for Ed the right way to do it?
I think not. I think not today. I think it's a step that needs to come. But right now we're trying to identify technologies to accomplish goals which we haven't set clearly. We have a K through 12 system that was originally designed for a population that either went into agriculture or personal services and eventually morphed to support industrial age manufacturing. The goal is basically to take the entire population as public school students and run them through a consistent and regimented process, at least through what we describe as middle school, through 8th grade. And we allow very minor diversification in high school, primarily to sort out those who are going to be able to continue in education, in higher education, and those who need to exit formal education into some other kind of endeavor. In today's world, we know it's not the way things are. And we execute extremely badly. We have teachers represent the lowest 20th percentile of average SAT scores today instead of the top. We used to have the pick of the very top performers of half of our population when women could only choose between a small number of professions. Quite a few of the most brilliant of them went into education and served at every level of K through 12. Today, that's just not the case. It's a low status job that pays poorly, and in urban and rural districts, they have a very hard time even keeping the seats filled, much less doing quality control. And we've learned a number of things, like if you don't learn to read by 4th grade, our education system will fail you. First of all, your ability to learn to read is prescribed after that. But more importantly, the assumption is you have learned to read. And after that, the coursework expects a person who's able to read and comprehend at a high level. Numeracy, we do really basic mathematics until about 6th grade, where we introduce things like ratios and more complex mathematical thinking. And in Los Angeles County, for example, if you were, or in California more broadly, if you're a child of color, the chances that your middle school math teacher was certified to teach math is only 16%. And so you begin to question the structures that we have in place and what our goals are. So before you begin looking at how you approach technology to get specific pedagogical goals, we have to understand what's the purpose of our broad education system. Is it provide, I always thought when I was a kid, it was to provide equity of access to the American dream. Anybody who could be successful in our K-12 environment would be given a golden ticket and have the ability to compete in our economy. I don't think that's the equity is quite the purpose anymore. In fact, a lot of what's driving this research is the fact that we don't have enough STEM qualified students to serve industry. And is our number one job of our public education system to provide inputs to industry. If you look at China right now, they're having a huge problem because so many of their kids have gone through to university educations and done quite well. But most of their jobs are on the factory floor, and these kids don't want those jobs. And so you see huge unemployment. we have a gross misalignment of goals and objectives. And I worked closely with the Gates Foundation, raised $14 million from the brothers, and I appreciate it very much. But the focus is down the path. It's as though we already know what we're doing this for. I think we need to divide things, K through 4, numeracy and literacy, which is a base requirement for everyone in our society to be a good citizen and to be able to survive. From middle school, though, I think we need to move sorting down a little bit earlier. Are we doing skills development? Are we helping for self-actualization, to develop good citizens, good people, for people to learn to work in teams and groups, to work on projects, to be able to understand what completion is, how to work in teams with people who have varied skill levels? And in high school, some need skills development for specific activities that we need them in the economy. Some need to prepare for higher education, and some need to prepare for the fact that there aren't going to be jobs for them. And so finding some other way to participate in society.
All right, yeah, let's so you've raised a bunch of different issues there. We've picked on teachers a bit. We've evoked China and the sort of international competitive space out there. So I'd love to get a teacher's perspective. We've got two on here, both Brian and Linda. Linda, let's hear your perspective. I mean, you've taught in places all over the world, and we've talked a little bit about where the gaps are from your perspective, teaching here in the U.S., both in New York and down here in little old North Carolina. What do you think about what Larry and Russ have said so far?
I actually agree with a lot of what's been said. I don't particularly love it, but I think it's true. I do take issue a little bit with the formulaic approach that America has towards its education. I think you're right that we are trying to make people for an industrialized age that no longer really exists. You know, that whole sentence you hear over and over again about how teachers are trying to teach students for jobs that haven't been created yet. You know, that is we're never going to be able to do that based on the system we currently have. It just simply isn't agile enough. It's not adaptable enough. It's test-based. And even the conversation that we're likely to have today is going to relate back to, for example, the PISA results. And I heard, Russ, you said about the math. Math is one of the things that you're concerned about. We need to do something about. Absolutely, we do. I mean, according to the PISA results, America's lagging behind by a long way. But again, if we're going to use test results to judge a nation of children, then what you're going to end up with is an education system that relies on test results. And therefore, all the teachers are going to be framed in that way.
So Brian, what do you think?
So I would also plus one a lot of what I've heard, so I'll take it in a little bit of a divergent direction. I'm a big Clayton Christensen disciple that believes it's very hard to innovate from within. So a lot of my projects, I try to get permission with innovation champions to innovate on the margins or outside of it. So when I look back at my career and I think about things like No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top or efforts like what we're seeing now from the Biden stimulus package around technology and training and remote infrastructure, I'm like, we're about to screw it up again. We have a huge amount of investment coming in, and what we'll do with it, unless somebody puts better guardrails on the innovation, is somebody will go, hey, with that innovation money, I just want to add some more mask stations or some more hand sanitizing stations, instead of thinking very critically about 3 teams you need in your school buildings, your universities, and your workforces. Yes, you need an implementation team, and there are pieces of that will deal with the operations and what's happening. But you also need a transformation or innovation team that is looking further out. And then finally, you need a team that has complete permission to fail and innovate. So if you look at what happened with I3 or Race to the Top, everybody got a little to a lot, right? We gave a bunch of money to these side projects that had no capacity or knowledge whether they would innovate. Some had silos of excellence, right? And they were able to, kind of move the ball forward. But somebody's got to look at those dollars and say, we're prioritizing where to place the money. We're seeing these promising innovations that are scalable, and we've got to take them to the next place. So until we get serious about that, a lot of us operate on the fringe and we try to help somebody disrupt the market. And then all of a sudden we're mainstream and everybody goes, my gosh, what a brilliant idea. But it was in place 10 years before. So how does that translate to students or to staff or to educational ecosystems? We got to get with decision makers that allow that permission and freedom to have a couple of different levels of teams working on these big problems. And we've got some big ones, like the grand challenges of tomorrow across the world, what we're going to do about climate, what we're going to do about infrastructure, and digital equity and access as a fundamental right. That's an area that we should be reshaping right now because we have no idea the innovations that are going to come out of that. But what we're doing a lot of times, regardless of who's elected, is giving a little to a lot. And we've got to flip that and get into innovation hubs or centers that are really operating outside of that and make our case almost in a stealth way until we disrupt the market in different ways.
Yeah.
So,
if I could,
Marc, sorry, go ahead, Russ.
Yeah. So I think the one thing I from what I'm hearing is it's not an either or. So I agree. We absolutely need to change the way school works, top to bottom. There's no question about it. At the same time, we've got to be educating the kids and keeping them on track and really trying to figure out how to do better. I don't like standardized tests. I don't like how we test. One of the things I've advocated for, especially on the ed tech side, is to look at better ways of real-time formative assessment, where we can actually intervene in real time, know what's going on with the kids, and give tools to the teachers. But one of the things that I really don't like about our school systems right now, and again, this is why we need an innovation hub, these innovation hubs or ARPA eds or whatever you want to call them. We've got to stop teaching single subjects. So math, literature, science, they're not independent subjects as they are now. With the way we are funding things in the federal government, though, you can't do anything differently. Everything is an incremental research project at this point. And you can't do incremental.
You can't get a first principle piece of paper out.
Right.
I think even before research, these principles are really critical. Now, we know that the science of literacy is out there. We know it. It just hasn't been implemented very well. Kids learn to read when they're reading about things they're interested in. You don't teach reading. You teach using reading
to access what
same with numeracy, project-based work. You start in the morning and you read a story about frogs, and then you find out where frogs lived in the world and how they're used in the, for blow darts or for food, and then you have as you dissect frogs, and you have kids who have different skill levels working in teams on these projects. But the issue we talk about in testing, my vineyard got paid for in high-stakes summative assessments when I was at Pearson. People pay for high-stakes summative assessments in order to evaluate the success of programs, and it's more important than making the program successful. We tried to to embed formative assessment not as a separate test, but as a component of the curriculum, so that you use AI basically and branch tree logic to decide whether you move on to the next topic or not, based on how well you've got a current topic. And you don't tell the kid or stop the kid. You inform the teacher what issues may be causing a failure to learn. But there's no money for formative assessments and curriculum integration. There's tons of money for evaluating whether schools should continue to be funded and whether teachers are doing a good job, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like to argue it's the political process. A long time ago, the far right, not feeling that after Reagan they couldn't elect another president, ran for school board seats based on social issues. They felt like teachers were teaching a left-wing criteria. But in doing so, they brought also this kind of industrial age measurement metric that you can't improve what you can't measure, and this conservative idea that we need to hold people accountable rather than experiment and innovate and focus on equity. And so we have a structure that it's very easy to get money to measure and very difficult to get money to improve, not in the research environment, in the practical environment.
Yeah, incentive alignment is really key. So let's put a pin in that for a second. And Marc, we haven't heard from you yet, but I want to hear. I want you to share your ideas around empowerment and how that fits in with everything we just talked about.
Yes, I'm going to go in some different directions. First, the education system that we have all over the world, it's the same system, is a great artifact of the 20th century. And it served the 20th century well, and I don't think it's going to serve the 21st century at all. I would much rather go around it. I would resign from the education space and want to start something different. What I think the kids need, and I think they're different kids. They're not anything like what we were. They have totally different capabilities, et cetera. They need to accomplish things. They need to be empowered and get things done. And my definition of empowerment is you took something that wasn't good before and you made it better, or you took something that didn't exist before and you made it exist. And I see those things, I call them empowerment hubs, starting up around the world. What we do in education is that we take what we had and we put incremental changes on top of it. I call that icing, incremental changes. And we put the icing on that cake and we leave the same cake rotting underneath, more or less. And so what I would like to see innovation for, coming back to our subjects, is not improving educational outcomes. Those are 20th century educational outcomes, not what we need. What we need to do is things that we couldn't do before. What are the kinds of things? That's where the research ought to go. What couldn't kids do in the 21st century, in the 20th century, that they can now do in the 21st century? And how will that empower them and empower all of us to move forward in a very, very different way?
Very interesting. Yeah. So we talked about a number of the gaps that we're all perceiving. We're sort of dancing around the whole thing. And I think we're all of one mind that, the systems that we have got us to where we are today need to be maybe fundamentally overhauled. Is that what we're saying? And but for me, as we're thinking about an ARPA, replaced. Okay.
Better.
But as we think about an ARPA for education, I know there's a lot of discussions around the structure of that, Russ, and and you mentioned Clayton Christensen, Brian, who favored a sort of decentralized fringe approach to it, as opposed to like a really centralized, government funded approach to like, how do we actually innovate education? Is the ARPA model the correct one? And is that going to serve us, or is it going to be a multimodal sort of approach? What do you think, Russ?
Well, one, when you actually dig down and look at how DARPA funds programs, it depends on the program. So there's not really one research model at DARPA. There are a bunch of different ones. My goal was I really wanted to try to blow things up a little bit. So I had like Eva Baker and a few education experts on the team to keep things honest and keep us on track. But I made sure, I wanted to have some other talent in there. So I was bringing in professionals in other areas. That's something it's hard to do in other types of models. And we set some ambitious goals. Now, I think as long as what you're doing is really knowing what the outcome you want to measure and change is going to be, whether it's, some procedure or a math score or higher order learning, whatever that's going to be, you've got to set that out there. You may not know how to get to that goal when you start your project, and you've got to have an agile enough system that you can actually change course as you're learning about the topic. So again, there's a lot of ways to get to the DARPA kind of approach. It just means you kind of have to blow up the research process that's typically done.
May I ask a question, actually, of the whole group? which is there's another model in the world now for this, which is the X Prize model, which is to say we're going to offer a big pile of money and we're going to get lots of teams to compete, and then somebody's going to get that money, and nobody even has to fund it. It can come from insurance or other ways. But that's a different model. And I'm just wondering what people think about that model versus the DARPA model, which I went through.
Yeah,
I don't think it's an either or on any of these, and then I'll shut up for a bit. I really think what we need is a mixture of everything we've heard here today. So one, we need to change the system. But we also need to just quit doing things and developing things the way we've done before. That could mean X Prize. That could mean an ARPA Ed. Could be a bunch of things.
Yeah, I was listening to folks talk about this notion of the both and, right? So Grinny has this great phrase, don't opt for the tyranny of or when the genius of both and is at your fingertips. It's like, first of all, we have had government investment over time in sectors that fueled innovation and progress and change in various industries. Now, when that gets designed for the problems of tomorrow around just something specific like climate, how does that move into our current structures until they are replaced, our fringe structures while we're replacing them, and then allow for opportunities to bring things to market that actually work? So if we're back on this idea that government could be an epicenter to serve as a catalyst for how that happens, we have a lot of evidence in our country around research universities, research park universities, that when those clinical trials are birthed there and new economic models come out of them, that we can do some interesting things around products and services. Now, let me take that back to Marc's area of expertise, where how are we training young people to think like that? And how are we giving them experiences where they can behave like a scientist or behave like an innovator? That requires some deep thinking about who's in charge of at least the existing system right now to start to spin that up. So last comment, many of you know Joe Klein, who used to be at New York City schools. And whenever I tell the Joe Klein stories, I always pair it with Bill Walsh. You remember Bill Walsh, the great football coach? And Bill Walsh had all these assistant coaches that became head coaches. Well, look at Joe Klein's tree of who worked in New York City at that same time and then went out and tried to innovate. And you will see a mixed road of success, attrition, failure, mistakes, etc. But every one of those people had a portfolio mindset for education. And what I mean by that term is you can have different ways to go at different problems, and you can fund it in different ways. So Marc, back to your question of X Prize, I'm for it as long as the people that are looking at the innovations that are birthed out of it think really critically about how to pair it with further investment, pair it with further expertise, not just give people blank checks to say, well, good luck, I hope you're an innovator. We've really got to surround those people with communities, global communities. Now that we've learned in the pandemic, we can do it even more so everywhere. That's when I think you'll start to get it at scale. And I said last point, but one more point. We can't approach it through rugged American individualism. We have to approach it through different ways that cultures go at it around teams and organizations.
Can I ask a question of those of you who've done the research? So systems theory suggests that this portfolio method requires that there's an integration between the elements of the portfolio. And much of what we've done in
framework.
Yeah, common framework. And much of what we've done in education, I spent a lot of time in curriculum development and test development and those sorts of things, separate from teacher preparation, separate from, the neurology of learning, all these sorts of things. It is a DARPA model similar to a NASA model. NASA had to innovate across a broad system. They had chips, they had uniforms, they had astronaut training, they had ballistics, and yet there had to be a common framework to create a new system of space exploration. Education, we call them school systems for a reason. There are so many complex elements that have to come together, and they have to be guided by, social goals that have to be established and focused. How do you do research across this broad spectrum of a system requirement?
Well, there's one reason why DARPA does not continually fund education or the behavioral sciences, and you just outlined it. It's because it is so complex. And again, they don't like, it's run by engineers largely, and they don't like the "it depends" answer or the "we're not sure exactly how this works" answer. Even though they, in an engineering sense, they will, but they're not really geared for us. But I think it's very much like the NASA model. The most successful DARPA programs I've seen don't necessarily always hit their moonshot that they're looking for, but they always spin off a lot of technologies and applications that do have large impacts. So I'd say the chances of hitting your mark on a DARPA program are fairly low. It's the other things that you learn along the way by setting those large marks and that you produce that actually make a lot of the differences.
But NASA did both, right? They got a man to the moon and they gave us Tang.
Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the fundamental issues here is really looking ahead to where, what is education going to look like in 2030 or 2035, right? And I've always been troubled, just my own experience and the experience of others I've known around this talent issue, which you touched on, Larry, which is, a big part of the trajectory of your education, of a child's education today, depends upon you having a really good teacher or not, right? So I had at one point a bad calculus teacher, and that affected the trajectory of my mathematics, and I was stuck with that person for an entire year. I find that untenable, and just, we should not be standing for that. So when I first read Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson and saw that idea of the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, I thought, there it is. If I'm unshackled from this person, this instructor, and of course today we have the internet and everything, but will the ratio of qualified teachers to students and students who are working with machines like Dexter Fletcher, intelligent tutors, and things like that, will that actually change the whole systems mix of what education looks like, and how do we solve for that? And do you agree or disagree, Linda and Brian?
I agree that it will change education, but I think before we get to a point where we can talk about revolutionizing education to that extent, we need to acknowledge that it's not working the way it is right now, and then figure out a way to actually get it to change, as opposed to implementing the Christmas tree model where we just go around adding things on all over the place, which is exactly what normally happens. I mean, what you were talking about, Marc, was with the icing. You've still got the rotten cake underneath. You've still got the Christmas tree there. We need to burn the Christmas tree down. we need to start again. But that's frightening. How do you bring a whole education system along?
Which just happened this year, didn't it?
Well, yes, but to some extent. But then we've got that. Yeah, exactly. We've got that substitution. What happened this year was, instead of worksheets being given in classes to a person in person, they were put onto a machine. I mean,
and printed out at home.
Right. It really wasn't a redefinition of anything. It was a substitution thing that happened. And that's what happens when teachers are unprepared for the change that is about to occur. And it was the same with with core education. I mean, it was, the Common Core is a fantastic product. I mean, it really could work. It really is supposed to make children think more. It's supposed to concentrate our efforts on critical thinking and things like that. But the way that it was implemented, the teachers weren't prepared to teach it. They didn't know what to do. So there was this backlash instantly. So, I mean, I think the biggest change here is how do we implement this amount of change in a system that is this broken and still have, a generation of children that can function in society? How do we get to that point? And it has to, those are the questions we need to answer. We can sit and we can talk about all of these amazing ideas that we have and ways that we could do it. But if we can't find a way to bring everyone together and raise that benchmark that currently is the American education system, so that every child leaves school being able to do the things we need them to do to function in society, to get a good job, to be able to qualify to join the armed forces should they want to, or whatever it is that we've decided as a society we need, right? That we're definitely at odds with what we need and what we're trying to make.
Somebody else wanted to talk first. Brian, you
go ahead, Mark. I'll come second.
There's going to be a huge disruption, and there's going to be a lot of people affected for a long time. But if we were successful in preparing all the people in the way you're thinking about, they would not be prepared to live in the 21st century. Literacy is something that comes from a machine. If we all moved to China, we would be perfectly able to read and write using our phones. These kids are going to live, forget tomorrow, they're going to live 20 years, 30 years, 40 years from now. And if we're not thinking about who they are, and I haven't heard a kid mentioned, the whole time, I think the kids are going to be fine. I think the issue in COVID was not that the kids needed to be in school. All they missed about school were their friends. What happened was that the parents were freaked out because they didn't want the kids at home. So what we've got to think about, what I think we need to think about, is a different way of raising kids in the 21st century that's not what we did in the 20th century, and not the same. We have to figure out what to do when they're really young, give them the right beliefs, give them the right things. When they're the age that we now call school, give them whatever it is to do, and then figure out how they move into some kind of a meaningful work in an age of automation and AI. And so it's really, everything else is going to be incremental. If we start with saying we got to fix the system, we got to change the system, we need a new system, we have to do something different with our kids. And the kids are going to do it for themselves no matter what we do, I think.
Well,
I think Marc points out what COVID told us.
Yeah. The danger with a lot of this, though, is, again, my fear with all of our innovation and what we're discussing, including the stuff I propose, is that it's just going to end up creating a larger digital gap between the middle class and upper class kids and those that we really need to be reaching out for. And when we talk about the innovation and changing the system, the ones that are in the worst position for being able to change their system at this point are those kids in the Native American schools or rural in Appalachia and places like that, where they just don't have the money or the resources to even do the current model, let alone a new model.
Well, the current model fails them completely.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I agreed.
The current model right now, the middle class and the upper class still has an opportunity to extract value from the education system. But if by fourth grade you're told you'll never be able to read, continuing on through the education system is a lost cause. And there's a huge percentage of Native Americans, of urban and rural, not changing the system, it's those people could be left behind is kind of odd, because they are already behind. No question about it. One thing COVID did do, to Marc's earlier point, though, that I wanted to pull out from that, is the structure of the system we have now is built for people who went to the factory or went to the farm to work all day. Yeah. And there had to be a place for their kids to be. And so why not teach them while they're there? And what COVID did is to say, what happens if those parents don't go to work and there's no place for the kid to go? And what we saw is our current education system has nothing to do with helping the kids prepare for life, because you just move that system without, with the parents still there, and it still didn't work. So I do think it did expose the fact that the schoolhouse model for 8 hours a day really has little to do with the success of education.
Yeah.
And the models that we use to teach have little to do with that structure. You can, as Linda said, you can just take it and bring the kids home and just send the worksheets there. It's
and then the next question is, how much does education, at least in the 20th century sense, have to do with preparing the people of the future? I think very, very little. And that's the main problem. On the other hand, it's everywhere, mostly because of colonialism and everything else. The same system, the same math, language, science, social studies exists around the globe. And so, but it's a system that was only good for the period of time when you and I and everybody on this screen grew up. It's not good for the time when these kids are growing up, and we're not thinking about something different. We're thinking about incremental changes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I want to try to just inflict one question on all of you. Let's assume that an ARPA for education has been formed. Biden's given it, it's got $100 million a year budget. Let's just say it may not be that, but I think that's asking a lot. But let's just say you're now a PM at ARPA for Ed. You've got a year, or maybe it's a multi-year deal, and you've got $10 million. I'd love to hear what each of you would focus on. Like, what would you do with that 10 million? What would you do first? And let's start with Brian. Yeah.
So I want to go back to Mark's comment that we don't have a student represented. We also don't have a person of color represented.
Right.
So it bleeds into my discussion on your question, because the first thing I would do is do what Biden seems to be doing early, which is assembling, again, diverse talent. Now, when you go into that diverse talent and you look at their records or their backgrounds, we could have another salon on, is it diverse within diversity, right? Or is it inclusive within inclusiveness based on role, expertise, age, etc. However, one of the first things I would do would assemble groups that need to have voices in the outcomes, right? The second thing that I would look at is back to this notion of how we want to address the future-facing systems we need, and how we're going to allow for opportunities with the systems we have is a big part of that money. So however you situate that in the various groups, like you organize anything, what is your end goal? What is your bearing point? What types of students, thinkers, citizens do we hope to create? We've already seen with the misinformation of the pandemic of, or the three pandemics, Richard likes to say, of, racism and COVID and also misinformation. We've already seen with those that we could do a lot more to address them. But it's also about, to Mark's point, preparing people with those skills, knowledge, and disposition sets to solve for problems we haven't defined. So I hate that phrase, we don't know problems that exist yet. We actually do know a lot of problems that will exist. The issue is we haven't prepared people to solve for them. So as we think about setting up that work, Richard, and your critical question, I think you've got to have leaders that are divergent, leaders that are skeptics, leaders from all backgrounds, to hammer out a common framework that works across not only education, but we haven't even touched on economic disparities. Until we can get into communities and ecosystems and say, look, you can't just choose any school. You can't just zip code yourself into privilege. We've got to change some fundamental issues around the economic systems so that universal basic income, things that are in that work start to make their way forward.
Yeah, that's one of the possible multiple choice answers, right? Is provide that basic income for education. But who has an idea for what they want to do with their $10 million first?
I can go. I'd form teams of kids, and I'd say, what do you want to do? And it's not that they will come up with the answers all by themselves, but they can understand how they need to be prepared. Nobody goes around giving them Oculus and saying, what could we do with this that we couldn't do before? That's what we really want to figure out. What can we do? We know what to do. what we did before. What could we do that we're not doing now? And that's a really important question that nobody that I've heard about is really thinking about. It's always, how can we change what we have to get kind of the outcomes that we used to get? If the kids can't read, they can't do this. If they can't do that, that's not the way the 21st century is going to be. The 21st century is going to move much faster than any of us think, that everybody will get connected to Starlink, and that everybody will have these things. There'll always be some differences. And right now, I think the beliefs divide between what we believe as people from the 20th century and what the kids believe as people who are looking around and seeing that they're growing up in a new world. I think that's much more important than the digital divide. Because if we don't believe what they believe, we're not going to be able to help them. And they're going to we're just going to hurt them. And I think we're hurting our kids a lot in education.
Well,
Okay.
one of the things we haven't discussed, two things that come to mind before we get off of here. One, Digital Promise is another group to be looking at this point for having access to leagues of innovative schools and things like that, and their attempts to bring together large groups of schools for test beds of diverse schools. So we need that. The other thing we haven't really discussed, and where I probably put $10 million, which I would say is not a lot of money in technology to get things done. But I'd start working on the special education world a little bit too. I think what the past year has shown us is that group has had the biggest negative impact in the education system from being at home. It's harder to port distance learning to some of these kids. So I'd be looking at those questions.
Okay. Linda, what would you do with $10 million?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I think $10 million is a small dollar amount. And
Yeah, I just chose a number.
it'd be hard to be impactful, but if for a slightly
10 billion.
larger,
Just go with 10 billion.
well, but for a slightly larger amount, Russ's idea that League of Innovative Schools, I would pick one of the schools with an innovative leader and the community around it. And I would spend a chunk of money paying parents not to go to work who live in that community, and kind of putting a bubble over them. The employers that are in that community, certain number of parents who are going to engage in community development, and recruit top teachers to that school. I would do it in some place like Vancouver, Washington, or someplace that is economically not seriously depressed, but is in a lower income and has a diverse population. And I would pour the money in, and I would take off all government regulation, and I would ask them, how you have 10 years and you're going to get paid, and these kids are going to complete the school cycle, and do what you think is best and watch them.
I want to let other people go, but I think that's what Larry Rosenstock did with High Tech High, and he's been at it for more than 10 years, and it really hasn't gone beyond San Diego, and that's a real question.
The Jefferson schools in Northern Virginia, same thing as High Tech High, very similar.
Well, there's
We
two.
need to learn from these, but I would do another of these.
Okay, I'm going to speak now.
Good.
I think that the only way we can really improve education in this country is through the teachers. I think that good teaching is worth more than anything else. It's about how you get to that good teaching, though. It's the training that needs to happen for teachers. It's the tools that we need to use. Technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of these things, I think, could really play a huge role in supporting the teacher to be able to get to a point where we have the ability to equalize levels of education for every child that's in America. And what I have found interesting doing research on the percentages, the disparity in education, the inequality of education, it's not necessarily by zip code. You assume that, obviously the underprivileged areas are going to have a lower standard of education than in our wealthier areas. And for the most part, that is somewhat true. But actually, even within schools that are considered wealthy or well off, the disparity in ability is huge there. And what we're not doing is helping our children that are finding things difficult, that find it harder to learn in the way that we have decided they must learn, right? We're not helping them learn. We're enforcing this old-fashioned way of teaching on every child in America, and it works for some, and it doesn't work for 80% of them. And that's a problem, because it means that, yes, to some extent, they're left floundering. They're left trying to figure out how to find their own way. They have a lack of resources to be able to do that. And then they lose that motivation and inspiration that we seek to build. As a good teacher, that's what you want. You want those light bulbs going off. You want children to leave at the end of the day excited about what they learned, with that feeling of ownership for their own education, and with that idea of being able to master something and achieve. And that level of inspiration needs to be generated by the teacher in the room.
I second a piece of that. I certainly, the teacher who says, I used to teach my subject, now I teach my students. That's what we want. We want a teacher who teaches the students and not the subject.
Powers.
But the interesting thing is that we limit, because we have a curriculum, because we've decided that reading and math and science and social studies is the thing. Our kids have so little choice. Our kids have much, much bigger imaginations than what we give them in school. We think we're exposing them stuff, but we are limiting them incredibly. And that really is something that we need to tell each other that we can't do, because it's really hurting it's just hurting kids.
You know,
Blackstone asked me,
oh,
they said they have $1 billion to invest in a tactical fund. And where would I put that billion in investment? This is not the same question you have. Where would I put that investment for biggest return on educational outcomes, profit for them? And I told them I would buy 50 teaching colleges from 50 liberal arts universities whose teaching colleges are the only things that are successful. Buy those 50 teaching colleges and set up a single program using advanced learning methodologies, allowing teachers to go into a classroom and a virtual classroom and be in front of virtual students and, you know, all of those sorts of things. And they went and they said, could you buy 50 of them for 200 million each or for 20 million each? And I said, absolutely, these schools are going out of business and this will keep them alive. That's what I would do. And because I agree with Linda, if you had a resurgence of high quality teaching out there and you gave them flexibility in their classrooms, we would have a way different world.
Yeah, you know, it was sad on my last week at the Department of Education. I did an in-service here down the street at the School for the Blind. I figured a few preschool teachers would show up for, you know, learning some STEM things. So I had Ramps and Pathways calling in virtually, Sesame Street, all of these experts. I ended up having people from all over the state. About 120 teachers showed up, which caught me by surprise. But what was very sad about that is most of these teachers, I mean, they came all this way, so they were very interested in learning, and they had no real incentive to being there. And they'd never heard of any of these things. So all of these basic teaching resources that we discuss at the Department of Ed and amongst ourselves, these teachers, I mean, they were eating it up, but they had no idea for engaging their preschool kids in basic science, imagination and learning and exploration.
Teaching colleges suck.
So Larry, thanks for offering up that $1 billion. So I'm going to raise the amount that we can spend in our first year of our SPM. But, you know, definitely, you know, now I've talked to each of you, I think individually, maybe, I don't think Russ and I have talked about this, but, you know, I've, and some of you know that I have an event I hold every year that I usually hold around Joint Forces Command. It's called the Simulation Century, where I talk about the idea that the last century was about the televised image. It was the first time in human history when we would reflect upon events in history by looking at footage of it, right? And Marshall McLuhan would say that has remapped our brains. And I believe that this is the century of simulation, where, it's not just preparation, going into places and safely practicing the way Sullenberger might practice landing an aircraft on a river. But, I believe we can teach algebra, how to code, all sorts of integrated sort of cross-discipline capabilities in these simulated environments. And I've got 30 years of experience building that. And I want to build the Oasis with people like you. So if you've seen Ready Player One, I want to build the Oasis. But not just build it as this monolithic thing that everyone has to learn how to contribute to, but have it be more like the internet, where the contribution system is massively parallel. It's democratized, where some basic levels of JavaScript and capabilities allow people to make things like, someone could just make a Tyrannosaurus Rex and make it animate properly and have all of its behaviors and put it up there on a sort of Apple Store-like environment where other teachers can grab it and drop it into their sim, and it would work inside of there. We could shorten the path to mastery for all sorts of things, everything from learning algebra to biology to physics, chemistry, math, all sorts of things. So I just wanted to get that plug in there before we run out. I'm really interested in advancing that. We've created some open source technologies for the DoD, like the virtual world framework, to try to do that.
Good for teaching, Richard. I mean,
exactly.
Multiplier.
Yeah, exactly. And then one of the skills we create with teachers is the ability to go in and actually have these godlike powers to put these worlds together. And it's like, let me take you, today, kids, we're going on a field trip inside of the human body, and we're going to go learn about the lymphatic system today, or whatever it is. And they don't have to be a coder to do it. The teacher doesn't have to. They're literally just dragging and dropping things together and then seeing what happens. Or doing something maybe a little bit more structured, like let's go revisit the Battle of Agincourt, and all of us are going to become actors in that environment and understand, what's happening in there. Anyway, that's what I'm interested in.
And my 15-year-old would say, I don't give a damn about any of that stuff.
Right.
And so we need a system that really says, well, what do you give a damn about? And how can we make you into the person you want to be and not the person we think we want you to be, or that we think we need in the future, or that we think all of this? We don't have that ability anymore. We used to when the world didn't change, perhaps, but we don't anymore. So it's not about what we do today. It's about doing something different and better for the kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I like about simulation and AI is not just, like I said, simulating to prepare for something you've already preconceived, but even affecting that future, like designing a future that doesn't exist and then building towards it. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. Parting shots from everybody on, how likely is this thing going, are we going to get some energy behind this, and are we going to create an ARPA for Ed, or is it going to be this fragmented, more edge approach to innovation? What do you guys think? And Will, feel free to chime in too if you have an opinion on that. Linda, what do you think? I know you've got this outside of the country experience. What do you think the big difference is between other places you've taught in Africa and elsewhere and here?
I think that in other places there's less of a range of ability as far as, outcomes in schools. So for example, if you look at schools in Germany, the average school is going to have an average of C or a B for a student, and that's at a certain range, right? And you're going to have the majority of students clumped around that kind of area. You're going to have a couple of outliers at the top, you're going to have a few at the bottom, and the ones at the bottom, there's a plan for. Whereas what I see here, and when I say here, that's a very broad brush, right? Just the schools that I have seen, it doesn't appear to be that way. It appears that there is such a huge, there's two groups. There's one at the top and then there's one at the bottom. And we have a plan for the ones at the top. And that's, here's another worksheet for you when you've done that. And the ones at the bottom, we go, oh, why can't you do it yet? there isn't enough motivation or inspiration to get these children doing this stuff. And to Marc's point, why should they be doing it anyway? I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're teaching children, it's like, I don't know why we're doing that. Why are we making them regurgitate facts? For what? We've got the internet. Everyone can search the thing online. We don't need them to know all of these facts. And so we really do need to do a reframing. What are we trying to get, and what do we want? And I agree, student voice is key here. I have a panel of students that I have at my school, 7th graders, that I actually talked to Marc about, that really have very clear ideas about what they want from their education. And we as adults go, oh, we can't possibly ask students what they want. They won't know. They do. They know exactly what is wrong with the current system and what they want it to look like. And they have the advantage of also being digital natives. So they have all of this idea that you're talking about, Richard. They understand that language. They understand how they can use this technology to further their world much better than I do, than people in my generation do. So really, I do think we need to start listening to the children, start listening to the students, and then enabling teachers to be able to get to the point where they can support what the students want to do.
That would be great.
So Russ, our new Secretary of Education, he talks a lot about equity and that sort of thing. I'm not seeing a lot of technology innovation stuff in his bio, but did you have any insight into how open he's going to be to these ideas?
From what I'm hearing, quite open. And again, I talked to Marc Schneider, who is the head of IES. He and Kumar Garg, who was in the OSTP in the last administration.
Met him.
The two of them just wrote one where they were calling for a variety of things, and one of them was an ARPA for education. So they want to do it. It's just a matter of the government is very reticent when it comes to actually implementing Christensen type of models, and it's difficult to do. So I'm continuing to push on the topic, but I agree with Linda. I agree with the group. We need it's an all hands effort. I wouldn't want to see us just investing in the ARPA for education. It's got to be more. I guess the one thing I would push back on Linda, and I think you all know this, is, again, we talk so much, we default in our discussions to these kids who are the haves. When you get down to the kids that are most in need, their worries aren't necessarily what they're not getting in school. It's where's my food coming from today. Yeah. So I think it's more difficult to know from them what they need and how to get about it, get to them. We need to hit their Maslow's needs first.
And I think that's part of systems thinking, right? Yeah. Is understandings. The one DARPA program I worked on was called cognitive coupling. And we were looking at how do you actually create readiness level among like special operations and those folks. And we had transdermal patches, brain-to-brain interfaces we were starting to play with. And we realized you could actually affect state by increasing dopamine and oxytocin and that sort of thing, and we started saying things like, well, if you want better outcomes in education, you could just dope kids with oxytocin when they need to learn more or whatever it is. Of course, we're not doing that, but it does tell you the importance of nutrition, right? And if that's if that's such a big part of learning, then we should be helping fund that, which we do in public education, right? We try to make sure children have meals, right?
This concept of equity that's really kind of taken education by storm, I think, is often put in racial terms. But I think, as Linda talked about, our education system is designed for a bell curve environment, and what we have right now is an inverted bell curve. We have almost no kids in the middle. Everyone's either doing fine and charging ahead and moving towards their college degree, or they're at the other end and they're failing, and our school system.
We lost you there, Larry, or at least I did. Yeah.
Also for socioeconomic reasons. But I think that we have to remember that education exists in a political environment. It is a locally driven environment. We're going to have a hard time doing anything top down. All of the controls, there's 16,000 school districts, all of the controls are local. So when you talk about a DARPA for education, you're talking about not only a system change within education, but a different political model if you're going to influence it from the center. So I think right now we need to be in the fundamental discussion of what is the purpose of early education in the United States. Is it job preparation? Is it citizen preparation? Is it life preparation, as Marc would suggest? We have little idea what the careers of 30 years from now or 40 years from now are going to be. So how do you prepare someone to live in a society of constant change? We lived in a society of industrial structure, and that's how we were trained. How do you learn to be fluid? But I think we need to, that's where the DARPA effort is what are the societal requirements for how we raise children, and what is the role of education in that? That's, I think, where we need to start. Then everything else flows from that. We want to go to a moon. You have to define the moonshot. What is the goal? And the technologies come together. We innovate well. We don't have a clearly articulated goal for education.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. There isn't just one single goal, right? There are multiple goals. We're gonna have to have a full frontal assault on all of this. You're about to say, Marc.
I see it differently. I see that what's been going through my mind is when in the 1970s, I taught a class of ninth grade non-readers. And what I remember most about them is how capable they were at lots of things that had nothing to do with reading, and how great people they were. And it was really, we just have not focused on the kids at all. In the past, in the 20th century, we had to sort of do things in an industrial way, put 20 kids or 40 kids in a classroom, have one teacher in the front. We're moving into a very individualized world. We're moving into a world where every kid can have a different upraising, a different thing that fits that kid. And we're moving there very, very quickly, except, of course, in the system that we have around the world for education, where we're not changing much at all, but the world is changing outside that infinitely, and the kids get prepared for change because change is in their lives. Because every day their phone is different, every day their TV is different, every day their YouTube is different. They're getting prepared for that. We are just holding them back by our views from the 20th century. And the biggest change we need is in us, not in them. The biggest change we need is in our beliefs, in my view.
And that goes back to the policy we're trying to affect, right? I think it's well known that policy trails technology by at least 10 years. And that's one of the battles that we have. We've got to convince people in the central sort of decision-making halls that this is important, and it needs funding, and it needs, and that's the one question that I have is, do we really need like this one big lightning rod to attract the funds and the innovators and build around it? Or should it be this forest of lightning rods that are each focused on different elements of it?
And will even that work? Lorene Jobs tries that, right? And I don't know how they're doing, but I haven't heard great things.
But it sounds like all we need is Larry's billion, and we'll go make the change happen there.
Waste that.
I mean, they literally, companies like Blackstone, there's so much money flushing around that if you can show people how to make money in education, it will land there. We need education to be the new pornography.
Well, that's a great thing about DARPA. You don't always have to show that it's going to make money. You just have to show that you've solved the DARPA hard problem, right? And some of those don't even.
Forgive me, Larry, but making money in education to me is pornography.
Well, I hear you. I worked for Pearson, and it was like working for Penthouse.
Right. You were going to say, Linda, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I think one thing that COVID has definitely taught us is that change is possible. I mean, to some extent, Unfortunately, it resulted in all the children being at home, at least from March till June, pretty much, and parents being disabled somewhat and being home teachers and all sorts of other things. You know, and it did mean that when we all came back, teachers had to pivot. They had to move, they had to make some changes and get online and get okay with using Zoom and figure out how to digitize what they were doing. And that is more change than I've seen in a long time. And it all happened so quickly in a matter of months, which makes me feel hopeful in a lot of ways. It means that it's possible, right? And these kinds of changes we speak of, it's so easy to get mired in the, oh, it's not possible, and oh, how could we, let's just give up before we start. And I think that's why we've ended up with this Christmas tree model, right? Is because we think it's easier to just add on. I feel like we need to, you know, really just seize the bull by the horns and redo, figure this out, get back to basics. You know, first principles, as you like to say, Richard, and figure out, get our blank piece of paper out and work together with the students and the teachers and the parents, and figure out some kind of individualized model that will allow us to be agile with what we're trying to do and provide options for mastery.
Yeah, that's great. And that seems like as good as a closing statement as any that we've made. So why don't we just wrap it there? Thank you all very much. We'll make sure all of you, well, you all have your contact information in the Zoom invitation, but we'll ensure that you all know each other. You all know each other well now, of course, but we'll also give you the full recording of this if you'd like to use it for your own evangelism and promotional efforts around these ideas. So great to talk to each one of you, and we'll continue the conversation. And Russ, if you get some any feelers out there or find people that get really interested in this and want to talk further, please let us know, and we'll be happy to engage.
There's a whole bunch of people, and I'm sorry for the ringing. My son with autism has been calling me nonstop here. So
you should take that. Absolutely.
Okay. I'll catch you guys later.
Thank you so much, Russ. Thanks to all of you, and we'll be in touch with the recording, and we'll let you know where it's actually going up. Probably this week, right, Will?
That's right. I'll get it up.
All right. Thank you all for caring about this subject and lending your brains and your hearts to it. I appreciate it.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Stay safe.